Hello, my friends. I am deep in the reeds, and here I am sitting in the dark with my fancy lighting and my horror stories, so look at the time, it must be October. And every October I review a horror novel. In the past I've stuck mainly to contemporary horror novels, but this year I thought I would go way back and look at a tried and true classic of the genre called The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson was a horror and mystery author writing between the 1940s and the 60s. She wrote over 200 short stories in her lifetime and a handful of novels. I thought I would jump straight into her most famous novel, which is often regarded as one of the best haunting ghost stories of all time, if not the most influential, and it was definitely an interesting read for this spooky season. The book is about a woman named Eleanor, who is this mousy, friendless woman who has serious anxiety issues, and she accepts this invitation to spend the summer in a supposedly haunted mansion. A guy named John Montague, who says he's a paranormal investigator, has invited multiple people into this mansion to spend the summer there. He knows that they've had supernatural experiences in their past, and he believes that will make them more receptive to the paranormal aspects of the house, which he can then study. Based on the premise of this book, I was expecting this initial veneer of scientific inquiry, trying to find a rational explanation for why the scary things at the house are happening and that sort of thing. But nope, Montague has no method at all. He doesn't even seem to really have a goal. He just, instead of telling people, oh, this is how we're gonna make something supernatural happen, he's just like, just sit around twiddling your thumbs, killing time, and if anything weird happens, I guess you can write it down, I don't know. Montague doesn't think at all to ask the creepy caretakers of the house any questions, because they definitely seem to know something. And even when they happen to find something a little spooky that might be supernatural, like a cold spot for instance, he just draws everyone's attention to it. He's like, hey, that's kind of interesting. Anyway, let's move on. He doesn't set up any experiments around it or anything like that. It gives this story this kind of aimless feeling that gets a little bit tedious. All of this is to say that despite Haunting of Hill House being fairly short, it's pretty slow paced. But in spite of that, I was really enjoying the first chunk of this book, and it's because the book's biggest strengths lie in things like character and theme, the way that Shirley Jackson uses the characters to hint at motifs of interpersonal fears just as much as she's playing off of conventional ghost story fears is really great. There's a lot of stuff about social anxiety, fear of isolation or abandonment, interpersonal trauma, and most of this is centered around Eleanor. As she's driving to the house, you're getting all of these really great insights into her character, which are very important later on. She's passing by all of these idyllic homes and fantasizing about what her life would be like if she lived in those homes. She's also thinking of these sort of fairy tale motifs. So when she rounds the corner and sees this hideous, ugly, haunted house, it's like this dark twist on the thoughts she's been having. It's a really great way at establishing Eleanor, her relationship to the house, and a really effective use of slow atmospheric pacing. These things are all developed further as Eleanor meets all the other characters, especially Theodora, who's my personal favorite in the book. She's Eleanor's polar opposite. She's witty and outgoing and charismatic. Eleanor feels at one part inadequate around her, but also this very strong attraction to Theodora, which you can read as either platonic or romantic. The point is that Shirley Jackson plays up this dynamic, which becomes almost the core of the story, and it shifts over the course of the book as things develop. But then you also see the themes play out against the other characters, because when they all meet, you realize that they're all kind of wary about letting one another in. And then a character speculates at one point that maybe the rooms are so confusing to navigate in this house because the original occupants also wanted to hide themselves away from each other and wall each other off. So it's a very clear parallel to the characters themselves. So once again, a very intelligent way at constructing this book. I should warn you though, that if you're getting into a book like this purely for the scares, then you have to be patient because it takes almost halfway into the novel before anything major happens. Yet when it does, it's definitely memorable and effective even 65 years later. Now, I knew going into this how influential this was, and naturally, horror after this book was pretty built on and inspired by the story, so I knew a lot of the scares were going to feel pretty familiar to me. One thing I was surprised by, though, is the fact that this book is keenly aware of the horror that came before it, so much so that it's actually making jokes and poking fun at horror tropes from other stories. A lot of the humor comes out of the witty banter between the characters, especially when they're reacting to something that's spooky and supernatural. When they find the cold spot, somebody's just like, this will be a great place to chill our beer. Later on, Theodora makes a snarky comment to one of the caretakers who storms off in a huff, and Theodora's just like, I suppose she's gone to hang herself from the tower now. I was genuinely surprised at how much I was laughing at this book. Shirley Jackson does a great job of balancing the horror and the scares with this humor that plays off of the more melodramatic aspects of horror stories that came before this one. As the story unfolds, the more humorous aspects get pushed aside to allow for a more somber and suspenseful tone to take its place. The characters become increasingly less trusting of each other, and even the narration becomes less reliable as you go, which is one of the more interesting aspects of this novel. I was really hoping the book could maintain this momentum that had been built up so effectively. But unfortunately, I find that Shirley Jackson threw a major wrench into the works pretty late into the book. She introduces things like seances and spirit writing, but in a firmly satirical way. Because it's played for laughs, and it's played for laughs so late in the book when we had just been primed to take things a bit more seriously, I feel like it really undercuts what Jackson was going for. The more I thought about this choice, the more baffled I became as to why Jackson would introduce this aspect of the story now. After all, at the beginning of the story, the characters were just sitting around waiting for something to happen. Why not have the seance stuff happen then, as a means of trying to trigger a paranormal event? That way, if the characters are, making jokes, not taking it seriously, maybe the seance person can leave all indignant or whatever, and then the serious stuff can start coming in slowly, as a way of saying, oh, maybe the spiritual expert was holding the spirits back or something. That way we would have a much more consistent through line in Rising Stakes. Instead, we're kind of left to have this emotional whiplash between the satirical tone and the more serious tone right when it matters most to the story. I actually liked the very ending itself. It's just that what was happening around the ending kind of threw me off, so I felt like the book didn't really stick the landing. I should mention, though, that I brought up my complaints with some friends who I knew had read this book, and they hadn't really picked up on any satirical or humorous elements at all, so maybe I'm totally barking up the wrong tree here. But regardless of how you interpret this book, I think it's a solid horror novel. I think it would be great for beginners to the genre because the tropes will seem a lot fresher to you, and it's not as grotesque or gratuitous as a lot of modern horror is. Instead, it lets you just sort of soak in the spooky atmosphere. It's got a lot of really solid, creepy moments, some decent depth to it, and it's also got that broad appeal that makes me understand why it's such a popular horror novel all these years later. Overall, though, I would give it a 6.5 out of 10 because in spite of its strengths, it had some pretty large weaknesses, like I said, when they're all just sitting around waiting for something to happen, or the uneven areas towards the end and how it kind of underutilizes its own premise of paranormal investigation. But that said, I still enjoyed the book overall, and I know I'm going to read more Shirley Jackson. But yeah, that's my review. Have you read this book? What did you think of it? And what are you reading for Halloween? Anyway, that's my horror Halloween review for the year. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.